Welcome to another episode of Homerik. On today's episode, I want to talk about a new series here that I'm starting, which is the origins of music. Now, for those of you who don't know, I teach music and audio technology at SAE Institute. One of the things that I love to talk about is, well, music history. Probably to most of us here who love history, this is something of great intrigue. When we are looking into music history, I want to start with ancient music, because this really is one of the things that inspires Homerik, period. I mean, Homerik, the name, comes from the ancient Greek poet Homer. So, let's talk about this for a second. Now, I won't go too in-depth on this. I want this to be something fun. And I want to bring about just some awareness to some of the things that happened in ancient civilizations. Now, before we begin, let's establish something. What is music? Music is an audible language that requires rhythm and it requires form. Music is sound, but not all sound is music. We've actually discovered that music is really old. So old that we have found from the drum to even flutes made of ivory bone, existing as far back as 43,000 years before the Common Era? And did you know that we have also found evidence of music notation 4,000 years before the Common Era? This was given to us through the Sumerians. They presented musical notation in cuneiform, which was their language, their written language. And with cuneiform, this was a representation in honor of their ruler, Lipit Ishtar. The clay tablet that we have found is one of several songs honoring this ruler, and the most common one that we know of is the Hurrian hymn. Number 6, it tells of the goddess Nikal and how she blesses the world. Now, most of this music was passed through oral tradition, but some say this song was made 14 centuries before the Common Era. Now, I should address something very important. The information that we find in this musical notation is nothing like the form we use in modern music notation. We find that information in the medieval ages. You'll find that it's not very diverse in notes. It's got very repetitive form, but it's one of the first pieces that we have that's been written down. And to be able to even hear this ancient hymn today is magnificent on its own. I hope you'll appreciate it as much as I do. Now, aside from the Sumerians, let's talk a little bit about the Egyptians. Because the Egyptians and their incredibly dry climate is one of the few places on Earth that will find some of the oldest instruments ever made, like castanets and even the strings that came from the Mesopotamian region. Lyres and harps were a big thing for the Egyptian culture, and it was their favorite instrument, as a matter of fact. We have found instruments that seem to be the predecessors to things like oboes, trumpets, and flutes as well, and even organs. We've found essentially the foundation to how these instruments were made back in Egypt. Now, because Egypt is right on the Mediterranean Sea, it is only fair to assume, and it is true, that ancient Greece and ancient Rome that both also had a very significant impact on how music shaped within this time. A starking difference between the ancient Greeks and Romans and the ancient Egyptians was how they treated musicians. The ancient Greeks and Romans looked to musicians as part of culture. They were celebrated, as a matter of fact. They were put for religious worship or celebrations of victories in battle. But the Egyptians looked at musicians as mere craftsmen, of the lowest of the lows, in a sense, and were nothing more than performers who were supposed to execute their duty. Now, talking about the Greeks, there are two Delphic hymns that come from the ancient Greeks that are of interesting regard. They were found actually in 1893 on the wall of the Athenian treasury. The two Delphic hymns were composed with the idea that that person would be traveling on a pilgrimage to Delphi to worship the sun god Apollo. And did you know that they were performed by some 50 musicians and 40 choir people? That's a pretty big number. That was definitely not common. And this is a really interesting take on music. When you listen to the two Delphic hymns, these notes you'll notice the use of instruments and voice used together, and the usage of notes and how they use dissonance to create intrigue. It's one of the things that I loved about the Greeks. I mean, the Greeks were masters of stories and masters of many other things. We've had inventions and philosophies come from the ancient Greeks. So it's no surprise to me that the ancient Greeks also had very interesting music. One of the things I should mention is Pythagoras. Pythagoras was a philosopher and mathematician who ended up figuring out the tonal scale that we use still today. He's the person that we can thank for that. He was able to figure out that if you had put your hand in the middle of a string, it would create a tone that was an octave higher, and so on and so forth in other positions of the string. He was the person who was able to map that out for us and show that there is a mathematical relation to the physics of sound. I hand it to him. Credit where credit is due. Nice going, Pythagoras. Thanks. I hope this was an interesting video for you. I'll talk a little bit more about music history next time around. If you like this content, please give it a like and subscribe to Homerik. Next week, I'm going to talk more about medieval history and the music that was going on during that time. So stay tuned. Until then, ciao.